The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $70, and Cyrus Denham laughed so loud that a gull outside the warehouse lifted off the pilings and wheeled toward the harbor. It was the kind of laugh a man makes when he wants everyone to hear him agreeing with himself. He clapped his big pink hands once, then twice, then turned to the room as if the room had been waiting for his verdict. And he said loud enough for the back row that old Hollis had just bought himself a boat anchor with a keyhole in it. The room laughed with him, the way rooms in small towns do when the loud man expects it. A few of them looked away first because they knew Hollis Ward, and they knew that a laugh at his expense usually aged like milk left on the dock. The object on the block was a ship's lockbox, iron, riveted, salt-eaten down to a scaled brown hide. It sat on the auction table like a stone that had been pulled from the bottom of a well. The corners were rounded from years of being shoved against bulkheads. The lid had a raised brass plate that had gone green as pondweed, and the keyhole was a slit no bigger than a coin's edge. Someone had at some point tried to force it and given up. You could see the pry marks along the seam, old and clean, as if the box had refused politely and the person had walked away. The date on the auction bill was the 14th of April, 1978, and the place was Merrick's Cold Storage in the town of Port Isabel, Maine, where the cannery had closed the previous winter, and half the fleet had been sold south to men who wore watches worth more than the boat. The estate was that of Captain Elias Ward, a man dead 19 years, whose widow had at last followed him under a cold sky in February. The auction was the town's way of closing a book it had never quite understood how to read. Hollis Ward was 71 that spring. No relation to the captain, despite the shared name, a fact that had been the subject of 100 tired jokes over 100 tired years. He was lean, the way old rope is lean, stooped a little at the shoulders from a lifetime bent over benches, and his hands were the hands of a man who had spent 52 years as a marine locksmith and small vault man on the coast. Those hands were mapped with pale scars from files that had skipped, from brass shavings that had bitten, from the small, patient injuries of a trade that the world was quietly forgetting. He wore a canvas jacket the color of wet sand, a chambray shirt washed to the softness of an old flag, and a black work cap with the bill turned up from the habit of leaning close to keyways. Cyrus Denham was 51, ruddy as a boiled crab, heavy through the middle in the way of men who ate lunch on other people's time. He owned the biggest marine supply on the coast between Rockland and Eastport, a chandlery that had swallowed 3 smaller ones during the bad years. He wore a red sport coat that day over a shirt with an anchor stitched at the pocket and a gold ring on his little finger that caught the warehouse lights when he pointed. His truck outside was a brand new one, dark blue, with the shop's name painted on the door in a serif so proud it looked embarrassed. Cyrus had bid on the lockbox as a joke 3 times, driving the price up from $20 to $65, and then he had let Hollis have it at $70 so he could say what he said next, which was that any man who paid good money for a corroded chunk of ballast deserved to keep it as a lawn ornament. He suggested a name for it, right there in the middle of the crowd, and the name was the Sea Turd. And the room laughed again, and a few of the older men shook their heads and looked at their boots. Hollis did not answer. He walked up to the table, counted $70 out of a worn brown wallet, and laid the bills down flat. He put one hand on the box, just his palm, resting there the way a doctor rests a hand on a shoulder. He felt the cold of the iron through his skin. He felt something else, too, a small, careful weight inside that did not slide when he tilted it, and a faint offness in the balance that told him the interior was not a simple hollow. He did not say any of this. He signed the paper, took his receipt, and asked young Peter Auberge, who worked at the boatyard, if he would help him carry the box to his truck for the price of a coffee. What the crowd could not see, and what Cyrus could not have seen if he had stared for a week, was a mark on the underside of the lid's forward edge, small as a thumbnail, that had been stamped into the brass and then blackened by fire. It was the mark of the Halberd Line, a coastal freight company that had gone out of business in the winter of 1959. Under a cloud of scandal, Hollis had seen that mark exactly once before, on the transom lockbox of a tug called the Marigold, in the summer of 1954, when he had been called to reset a barrel tumbler for a captain who paid him in cash and thanked him twice. The Halberd Line had one captain that everyone in Port Isabel remembered, and that captain was Elias Ward. Hollis had learned his trade from a man named Absalom Reeve, who had a shop above a sailmaker's loft on Water Street from 1919 until he died at his bench in 1946. Absalom had said many things over those years, but the one Hollis carried in his mouth like a smooth stone was this: "A lock is a promise a dead man made, and it is not your business to break the promise, only to ask it politely, until it decides to keep you instead." Absalom had said it slowly, and he had said it more than once, and he had said it the last time on a Tuesday in October when the rain was hitting the loft window sideways, and Hollis had been 22 years old and holding a pin file too tightly. Hollis drove the box home along the coast road in his 1962 pickup, which was the color of a rained-on newspaper, and had 230,000 miles on the odometer and a bench seat repaired with a folded wool blanket. He drove slowly, because he always drove slowly. The lockbox rode in the bed, on a bed of burlap, tied down with 2 lengths of cotton rope that had once belonged to a lobsterman named Ellis, who had given them to Hollis in trade for a rekeyed cabin. The sea was to his left, gray and small-waved, and the sky above the sea had that pale yellow at the horizon that meant a change in the weather sometime before Thursday. There is a kind of patience that looks like weakness right up until the moment it doesn't. Hollis had lived inside that kind of patience for 50 years, and he had watched loud men come and go, and he had watched their shops go dark one by one, while his little door on Cutter Street stayed lit, and he had never once felt the need to say a word about any of it. The men who understood. The men who did not were not his to correct. By the next afternoon, the story of the Sea Turd had reached the counter at Delphine's Diner and the bench outside the feed store. Cyrus had told it 3 times before breakfast to 3 different audiences, each time with a little more polish, each time with the price a little lower in the telling, so that by supper Hollis had paid $70 for a rusted rock, then $50 for a rusted rock, then in one version at the barber shop dock, been given the rock for free, and paid the auctioneer for the privilege of hauling it away. In each telling, Cyrus was the wise man who had known better, and Hollis was the fool with the file who thought he could open the ocean. Nate Corliss, who had known Hollis since 1934, and had once run a repair skiff out of the same slip as Hollis's brother before the war, stopped by the shop on Cutter Street on the Wednesday. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and said, in the plain way of an old friend, that a man could be right and still look silly, and that maybe the box was just a box, and maybe Cyrus, for all his mouth, had this one about right. Hollis was at the bench with the lamp pulled close and a set of dental picks laid out on a strip of green felt. He did not look up. He said, "It'll open." Nate stood there another moment, and then he nodded and put his hat on and went out into the wind, and Hollis went back to the wardship of the keyhole. To understand what was inside that box, you had to go back to the winter of 1959, when a small coastal freighter called the Halberd Star had gone down off Mount Desert Rock in a storm that the Coast Guard had rated as no worse than average for February. Alias Ward had been her captain. He had been 44 years old, a quiet man with a wife and a daughter of 11, and he had been accused in the papers and in the town of running the vessel aground while drunk and losing 4 men to the water. The company had failed within the year. The insurance had refused to pay the widows. Elias himself had survived the sinking, only to die 8 months later of what the doctor called a bad heart and what the town called a broken one, and he had gone to his grave under a stone that his wife could barely afford, with the word "Captain" carved on it and nothing else, because what the town did not know, and what the widow had suspected but never proved, was that Elias Ward had been sober that night, and that the true fault had lain with the owner of the Halberd line, a man named Roland Denham, who had ordered the Halberd Star out into a warning with a hold overloaded past its lawful marks. Because he had a contract to meet in Portland, and a bank that was leaning on him. Roland Denham had been Cyrus's father. Roland had died in 1962, a rich man on paper, and had left his son the chandlery that would in time swallow the coast. Elias Ward, in the 8 months between the sinking and his death, had done what a quiet man does when the world has decided he is guilty. He had gathered his proofs, and he had put them in the one thing on earth that he trusted, which was the lockbox from the wheelhouse of the Marigold, the tug he had captained before the Halberd Star, a box that Absalom Reeve himself had built a custom barrel for in 1948. He had sealed it, and he had hidden the key, and he had told his wife only that if she ever needed the truth, she was to sell the box last, and to sell it plain, and to trust that a man with the right hands would find it when the time came. The widow had kept that promise for 19 years. She had lived on tea and mending. She had watched Cyrus Denham grow fat on her husband's ruined name, and she had said nothing, because a promise made to a dead man is a heavier thing than any promise made to the living. Hollis worked the lockbox for 11 nights. He did not force it. He did not drill it. He set it on a low bench under a green-shaded lamp, and he mapped the keyway with wax impressions taken so gently that the wax itself seemed to be doing the asking. He identified a 6-pin barrel of a kind Absalom had favored in the late 40s, with a false gate on the 3rd pin that would catch a hasty man and hold him. He filed a blank down over 4 evenings, testing, refiling, testing, feeling for the small, honest click that told him a pin had gone home for real and not for pretend. He drank 1 cup of coffee an hour. Young Peter Auberge came by twice to watch and did not speak because Hollis had told him once a year before that a lock hears everything, and Peter had believed him the way apprentices believe the true thing when they hear it. On the 11th night, which was a Sunday, at 14 minutes past 10 by the shop clock, the barrel turned. It turned with a sound like a held breath, finally letting go, a small and private sigh out of the iron. Hollis took his hand away from the key and sat back on his stool and did not open the lid for a full minute. He listened to the wind against the storefront glass. He listened to the tick of the electric heater. He listened because Absalom had taught him to listen to the last silence of a promise before it was answered. Then he lifted the lid. Inside the box, laid on a folded piece of oiled sailcloth, the first was a bound sheaf of papers, tied with black cotton tape, and the top page was the loading manifest of the Halberd Star for the 9th of February, 1959, stamped and signed by Roland Denham himself, showing a cargo weight that exceeded the vessel's legal capacity. The second was a small canvas pouch, heavy for its size, that when Hollis loosened, the drawstring revealed 22 gold double eagles, coins that Elias had evidently set aside over years, a sailor's private savings for a daughter he would not live to see grown. The third was a letter, folded twice, in a hand that was careful even under grief. The letter was addressed in the old style to whoever opens this box in good faith. It said that the writer was Elias Ward, captain of Port Isabel, and that he was writing on the 3rd of September, 1959, because he did not expect to see another spring. It said that on the night of the sinking he had protested the loading and writing and had been overruled, and that the written protest was in the sheaf above, initialed by the port agent whose name was there for anyone who wished to check. It said that 4 men had died who ought not to have died, and that their names were Callum Reese, Anders Vale, Thomas Purdy, and a boy called only Little Jack, whose real name was John Habert, and who had been 16. It said that the writer did not wish revenge upon Roland Denham because vengeance was a thing for God, but that he did wish his name back, and his daughter's name back, and that if the reader of the letter had any decency in him, he would carry the papers to the town paper and to the harbor master and let the truth do its slow work. The letter asked that the gold be given to the daughter, whose name was Muriel Ward, and who would, by the time of any reading, be a grown woman, and who deserved, the letter said, at least the small comfort of knowing her father had thought of her every day of the 8 months he had left. The letter was signed simply, Elias. Hollis read the letter twice. He folded it exactly along its old creases and put it back on the sailcloth. He sat in his shop with the lamp on and the wind at the glass, and he thought, in the plain way of a plain man, about what he had in front of him. He could have kept the gold. It was 22 coins. He could have burned the letter and sold the papers to Cyrus for a price that would have kept him in coffee for the rest of his life. He could have done any number of quiet things, and no one would ever have known. The luck had asked its question, and only he had heard the answer. He did not do any of those things. He never even considered them long enough to name them. He put the 3 items back in the box, in the order they had lain, and he closed the lid, and he set the box on the passenger side of his truck under an old wool blanket, and in the morning he drove to the small gray house on Larkin Street where Muriel Ward Doherty, 41 years old that spring, worked nights at the county hospital, and slept days behind drawn shades. He knocked softly. When she came to the door in her housecoat, with her hair still pinned from sleep, he lifted his cap and said only that he had brought her something of her father's, and that he would leave it on the porch, if she preferred, and that she was to open it when she was ready. She looked at him for a long moment with her mother's tired eyes, and she said, "Come in, Mr. Ward," and he did. And he set the box on her kitchen table, and he told her, in as few words as he could find, what he had heard from the Eyre. He would not stay for coffee. He would not take a single coin, he said. That was your father's business, and it is your business now. and I am only the man who turned the key." And he went out and got into his truck and drove back to Cutter Street and opened his shop at the usual hour because it was a Monday, and Mrs. Alverson was bringing in the deadbolt from her back door at 10. The papers went to the Port Isabel Gazette on the following Thursday, and then, when the Gazette's editor understood what he had in his hands, to the Portland papers by the weekend. The port agent, still living in a nursing home in Bath, confirmed his initials on the written protest. 2 of the 4 widows. The stone in the churchyard was recut that summer, at the town's expense, to add the words "Captain of the Halberd Star, wrongfully accused," and the dates of the men who had gone down with her. Cyrus Denham said very little. He was seen at the diner exactly once in the week the story broke, and he did not order. His chandlery lost the town's harbor contract that autumn, and the bank's contract the spring after, and by 1981 the doors were chained and the serif on the truck had begun to peel, and by the fall of that year he had moved south to a town in Florida, and where the story of a rusted lockbox and a $70 bid could not follow him past the county line, or so he hoped. The box itself, at Muriel's request, was placed under glass in the small maritime room of the Port Isabel Library, with a typed card that gave the true story in 7 careful sentences. Hollis was not named on the card. He had asked that he not be, and Muriel, who understood by then the shape of the man, had honored the asking. On an evening in late September of that year, when the light on the harbor had gone the color of weak tea, Hollis walked down to the library after it had closed and stood on the sidewalk outside the window. He could see the box from the street, lit by a small lamp that the librarian left on for the fishing boats to see by. He stood there for perhaps 3 minutes, with his hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket and his cap pulled low. He did not go inside. He did not need to. Then he walked back up Cutter Street to his shop, and he turned off the lamp over his bench, and he went home to a supper of bread and stew, and he slept the untroubled sleep of a man who had for the 53rd year in a row kept a promise made by someone he had never met. So I will leave it with you. If the lockbox had come into your shop that spring, and you had heard what Hollis heard in the weight of it, and you had spent 11 nights of your own life persuading a dead man's iron to open, and you had found gold enough to change your circumstances lying on a piece of oiled sailcloth in the lamplight, would you have carried it, at first light, to the tired woman on Larkin Street and left before she could thank you? Or would you have folded 1 coin, just 1, into your pocket on the way out the door, and told yourself that the dead do not count what the living keep?